Welcome. Can I turn this on? Maybe? All right.
Can people hear in the back?
Can you guys hear me? Is the mic on? No? Maybe you can ask them to turn it on. Maybe we can get a big, there we go. All right. Maybe we can get a bigger auditorium, we'll see. So welcome to CS 183B. I'm Sam Altman, I'm the president of Y Combinator. 9 years ago, I was a Stanford student, and then I dropped out to start a company, and then I've been an investor for the last few. So at YC, we've been teaching people how to start startups for 9 years. Most of it's very hands-on and specific to the startups, but 30% of it is pretty generally applicable. And so we think that we can teach that 30% in this class. And even though that's only 30% of the way there, hopefully it'll still be really helpful. We've taught a lot of this at YC already, but it's all been off the record. And this is the first time that a lot of what we teach in YC is going to be on the record. So we've invited some of our best speakers to come and give the same talks they give at YC. We've now funded 720 companies. And so we're pretty sure that a lot of this advice is pretty good. We can't fund every startup yet, but we can hopefully make this advice very generally available. Guest speakers are going to teach 17 of the 20 classes. I'm only teaching 3. Counting YC itself, every guest speaker has been involved in the creation of a $1 billion+ company. So the advice shouldn't be that theoretical. It's all from people who have done it. All of the advice in this class is geared towards people starting a business where the goal is hypergrowth and eventually building a very large company. Much of it doesn't apply in other cases, and I want to warn people up front that if you try and do these things in a lot of big companies or non-startups, it won't work. It should still be interesting. I really do think that startups are the way of the future, and it's worth trying to understand them. But startups are very different than normal companies. So over the course of today and Thursday, I'm going to try to give an overview of the 4 areas that you need to excel at in order to maximize your chances of success at a startup. And then throughout the course, the guest speakers are going to drill into all of these in more detail. So the 4 areas. You need a great idea, a great product, a great team, and great execution. These overlap somewhat, but I'm going to have to talk about them somewhat individually to make it make sense. You may still fail. The outcome is something like idea times product times execution times team times luck, where luck is a random number between 0 and 10,000, literally that much. But if you do really well in the 4 areas you can control, you have a good chance at least some amount of success. One of the exciting things about startups is that they are surprisingly even playing field. Young and inexperienced, you can do this. Old and very experienced, you can do this too. And one of the things that I particularly like about startups is that some of the things that are bad in other work situations, like being poor and unknown, are actually huge assets when it comes to starting a startup. Before we jump in on the how, I want to talk about why you should start a startup. I'm somewhat hesitant to be doing this class at all, because you should never start a startup just for the sake of doing so. There are much easier ways to get rich, and everyone who starts a startup always says, that they couldn't have imagined how hard and painful it was going to be. You should only start a startup if you feel compelled by a particular problem, and that you think starting a company is the best way to solve it. The specific passion should come first, and the startup second. In fact, all of the big successes we have at YC followed this. So for the second half of today's lecture, Dustin Moskovitz, the co-founder of Facebook and Asana, is going to take over and talk about why to start a startup. We were so surprised by the amount of attention that this class got that we wanted to make sure we spend a lot of time on the why. Okay, so the first of the 4 areas, a great idea. It's become popular in recent years to say that the idea doesn't matter. In fact, it's almost uncool to spend a lot of time thinking about the idea for a startup. You're just supposed to start, throw stuff at the wall, see what sticks, and not even spend any time thinking about if it'll be valuable if it works. And pivots are supposed to be great. The more pivots, the better. So this isn't totally wrong. Things do evolve in ways that are difficult to predict. And there's a limit to how much you can figure out without actually getting a product in the hands of users. And great execution is at least 10 times more important and 100 times harder than a good idea. But the pendulum has swung way out of whack here. A bad idea is still bad, and the pivot-happy world that we're in today feels really suboptimal. Great execution towards a terrible idea will get you nowhere. There are exceptions, of course, but most great companies start with a great idea, not a pivot. If you look at successful pivots, they almost always are a pivot into something the founders themselves wanted, not a random made-up idea. Airbnb happened because Brian Chesky couldn't pay his rent, but he did have some extra space. In general, though, if you look at the track record of pivots, They don't become big companies. I myself used to believe ideas didn't matter that much, but I'm very sure that's wrong now. The definition of the idea as we talk about it is very broad. It includes the size and the growth of the market, the growth strategy for the company, the defensibility strategy, and so on. When you're evaluating an idea, you need to think through all these things, not just the product. If it works out, you're going to be working on this for 10 years. So it's worth some real upfront time to think through the long-term value and the defensibility of the business. Even though plans themselves are worthless, the exercise of planning is really valuable and totally missing in most startups today. Long-term thinking is so rare anywhere, but especially in startups, that it's a huge advantage if you do it. Remember that the idea will expand and become more ambitious as you go. You certainly don't need to have everything figured out in a path from here to world domination, but you really want a nice kernel to start with. You want something that can develop in interesting ways. As you're thinking through ideas, another thing that we see young founders get wrong all the time is that someday you need to build a business that's difficult to replicate. This is an important part of a good idea. I want to make this point again because it's so important. The idea should come first and the startup should come second. Wait to start a startup until you come up with an idea you feel compelled to explore. This is also the way to choose between multiple ideas. If you have several ideas that all seem pretty good, work on the one that you think about most often when you're not trying to think about work. But we hear again and again from founders that they wish they had waited to start a startup until they came up with an idea that they really loved. Another way of looking at this is that the best companies are almost always mission-oriented. It's difficult to get large groups of people to the extreme levels of focus and productivity that you need for a startup to be successful, unless the company feels like an important mission. And it's usually really hard to get that without a great founding idea. A related advantage of mission-oriented ideas is that you yourself will be dedicated to them. It takes years and years, usually a decade, to create a great startup. If you don't love and believe in what you're building, you'll likely to give up at some point along the way. There's no way I know of to get through the pain of a startup without belief that the mission really matters. A lot of founders, especially students, believe that their startup's only going to take 2 or 3 years, and then after that they'll work on what they're really passionate about. That almost never works. Good startups usually take 10 years. A third advantage of mission-oriented companies is that people outside the company are more willing to help you. You'll get more support on a hard, important project than a derivative one. When it comes to starting startups, in many ways it's easier to start a hard startup than an easy startup. This is one of those counterintuitive things it takes people a long time to understand. It's difficult to overstate how important being mission-driven is, so I want to emphasize it one last time. Derivative companies, companies that copy an existing idea with very few new insights, don't excite people, and they don't compel the teams to work hard enough to be successful. Paul Graham is going to talk about how to get startup ideas next week. It's something that a lot of founders struggle with, but it's something I believe you can get better at with practice, and it's definitely worth trying to get better at. The hardest part about coming up with great ideas is that the best ideas often look terrible at the beginning. The 13th search engine, and without all the features of a web portal, most people thought that was pointless. Search was done, and anyway, it didn't matter that much. Portals were where the value was at. The 10th social network, and limited only to college students with no money, also terrible. MySpace had won, and who wants college students as customers? Or a way to stay on strangers' couches. That just sounds terrible all around. These all sounded really bad, but they turned out to be good. If they had sounded really good, there would have been too many people working on them. As Peter Thiel is going to discuss in the 5th class, you want an idea that turns into a monopoly. But you can't get a monopoly in a big market right away. Too much competition for that. You have to find a small market in which you can get a monopoly and then quickly expand. This is why some great startup ideas look really bad at the beginning. It's good if you can say something like, today, only the small subset of users are going to use my product, but I'm going to get all of them. And in the future, almost everyone will use my product. Here's the theme that's going to come up a lot. You need conviction in your own beliefs and a willingness to ignore others' naysaying. The hard part is that this is a very fine line. There's right on one side of it and crazy on the other. But keep in mind that if you do come up with a great idea, most people are going to think it's bad. You should be happy about that. It means they won't compete with you. This is also a reason why it's not usually dangerous to tell people about your idea. The truly good ideas don't sound like they're worth stealing. You want an idea about which you can say, I know it sounds like a bad idea, but here's specifically why it's actually a great one. You want to sound crazy, but you want to actually be right. and you want an idea that not many other people are working on. And it's okay if it doesn't sound big at first. Common mistake among founders, especially first-time founders, is they think that the first version of their product, the first version of their idea, needs to sound really big. But it doesn't. It needs to take over a small specific market and expand from there. That's how most great companies have started. Unpopular but right is what you're going for. You want something that sounds like a bad idea, but is a good idea. You also really want to take the time to think about how the market's going to evolve. You need a market that's going to be big in 10 years. Most investors are obsessed with the market size today, and they don't think at all about how the market's going to evolve. In fact, I think this is one of the biggest systemic mistakes that investors make. They think about the growth of the startup itself. They don't think about the growth of the market. I care much more about the growth rate of the market than its current size, and I also care if there's any reason that it's going to top out. You should think about this. I'd prefer to invest in a company that's going after a small but rapidly growing market than a big but slow growing one. One of the big advantages of these sorts of markets, these small but rapidly growing markets, is that customers are usually pretty desperate for a solution, and they'll put up with an imperfect but rapidly improving product. And a big advantage of being a student, one of the two biggest advantages, is that you probably have better intuition about which markets are likely to start growing rapidly than older people do. Another thing that students usually don't understand, or at least takes a while, you cannot create a market that doesn't want to exist. You can basically change everything in a startup but the market. So you should actually do some thinking to be sure, or at least as sure as you can be, that the market you're going after is going to grow and be there. There are a lot of different ways to talk about the right kind of market. For example, surfing someone else's wave, or stepping into an up elevator, or being part of a movement. But all of this is just a way of saying you want a market that's going to grow really quickly. It may seem small today, it may be small today, but you know, and other people don't, that it's going to grow really fast. So think about where this is happening in the world. You need this sort of a tailwind to make a startup successful. The exciting thing is there are probably more of these tailwinds now than ever before. As Mark Andreessen says, software is eating the world. It's just everywhere. There are like so many great ideas out there. And you just have to pick one and find one that you really care about. Another version of this that gets down to the same idea is Sequoia's famous question, why now? Why is this the perfect time for this particular idea and to start this particular company? Why couldn't it have been done 2 years ago? And why will 2 years in the future be too late? For the most successful startups we've been involved with, they've all had a great idea, great answer to this question. And if you don't, you should be at least somewhat suspicious about it. In general, it's best if you're building something that you yourself need. You'll understand it much better than if you have to understand it by talking to a customer to build the very first version. If you don't need it yourself, and you're building something that someone else needs, realize that you're at a big disadvantage and get very, very close to your customers. Try to work in their office if you can, and if not, talk to them multiple times a day. Another somewhat counterintuitive thing about good startup ideas is that they're almost always very easy to explain and very easy to understand. If it takes more than a sentence to explain what you're doing, it's almost always a sign that it's too complicated. It should be a clearly articulated vision with a small number of words. And the best ideas are usually either very different from existing companies in one important way, like Google being a search engine that worked just really well and none of the other stuff of the portals, or totally new like SpaceX. Any company that's a clone of something else that already exists with some small or made up differentiator, like we're going to be X beautiful design, or we're going to be Y for people that like red wine instead, that usually fails. So as I mentioned, one of the great things about being a student is that you have a very good perspective on new technology. And learning to get good at having new ideas takes a while. So start working on that right now. That's one thing we hear from people all the time, that they wish they had done more of when they were a student. The other is meeting potential co-founders. You have no idea how good of an environment